General Franco called the uprising against the Republican government a crusade, a fight for Christian civilization. Others called it fascism. It was for nearly 3 years the world's moral arena. Inside this mausoleum today, there is no hint of reconciliation. This huge tomb for Franco's men was hewn in a granite mountain by his defeated enemies, Republican prisoners of war. Before this altar of Christian piety and Francoist victory lies a man who led Spain's fascist party, José Antonio. The Great Dome celebrates the victorious nationalists almost as a celestial host. And below it, behind the altar, the Generalissimo himself, Franco, now deeply part of the Spanish language, in homage or hate. As a soldier, Franco had served the Republic, but his heart was monarchist. He was called a fascist and died a dictator. The contradictions of Franco are part of the heart of Spain itself.
Los moros que trajo Franco en Madrid quieren entrar, mientras quieren milicianos, los moros no pasarán. Mientras quieren milicianos, los moros no pasarán. No pasarán, no pasarán. Aunque me tiré del puente y también la pasarela, me verás pasar el Ebro en un barquito de vela. Me verás pasar el Ebro en un barquito de vela. No pasarán, no pasarán. Mil veces que los tiren, 10,000 veces los haremos. Tenemos cabeza dura, los del cuerpo de ingenieros. Tenemos cabeza dura, los del cuerpo de ingenieros. No pasarán, no pasarán. Se han hundido las banderas italianas. En los puentes solo quedan las que son republicanas. Y en los puentes
Welcome to the Distinctive Christianity Podcast, where sometimes we do deep dives on important historical topics, because we should. Today we have the great honor of speaking with Dr. Stanley G. Payne, Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It is not every day you get to discuss such an important historical topic with such a noted and distinguished historian. I've got just a few books I picked up off my shelf on the way here. He has 2 great books on fascism, one, Fascism, Comparison and Definition, a book, Spanish Catholicism, a historical overview, a biography I highly recommend, Franco, a personal and political biography. But today we're going to mainly focus on his Cambridge University Press book, The Spanish Civil War. Dr. Payne, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure on my part.
So July 17th through 19th, 1936, General Francisco Franco is taken by a tugboat to a nearby airfield where the plane, the Dragon Rapide, was waiting to fly him to Morocco. Leaving at 2 p.m. on July 18th, Franco arrives in Tetuan, Morocco, capital of the Spanish Protectorate, on Sunday, July 19th, and takes command of the most important part of the Spanish army, gives an initial radio broadcast calling for blind faith in victory. How did we get here, especially given that Franco's mind changed even between July 12th and July 17th?
Well, the military insurrection of the 18th of July was the initiative that really prompted the Spanish Civil War. And this was a result of the revolutionary process of the Second Republic and the counter-revolutionary response to that, which was, of course, inevitable once the revolutionary process had taken full and radical form.
You write that the conditions in Spain between February and July 1936, which eventually produced civil war, were unique in the history of 20th century European states in peacetime, for nowhere else did a parliamentary government preside over an equivalent breakdown of law and order without the stress of external crisis. So what was the Spanish Civil War? If someone has never heard of it, how would you say what it is and why it matters?
Well, the standard propaganda version, which is still accepted in most of the history books, was a struggle between liberalism or democracy on the one hand and fascism on the other. In fact, what it was a revolutionary, counter-revolutionary struggle, the only mass terrorist revolution in the 20th century history of Western Europe, which had been developing since 1930 and at the beginning of the Republic in 1931, finally in its climatic phase under the Popular Front in 1936, which began the process of complete breakdown of law and order and opening the way to violent revolution, but under the guise nominally of parliamentary government, a sort of Trojan horse approach, which was very effective. And the Spanish Civil War simply was the violent response of a large part of Spanish society to this process, this breakdown of law and order.
So let's talk about that. You speak of something called the grand camouflage. You already alluded to it, but you write that, contrary to popular thought, this, following the arming of the worker movements on July 19th, that this was proportionately the most extensive and also most nearly spontaneous worker revolution in a European country.
But the Republican government hesitated. They feared the consequences of arming the people. The coup had missed the swift victory it had expected. The workers fought back. The coup became a civil war, and the resistance became a revolution. Lora del Rio, 30 miles from Seville, was typical of hundreds of villages in southern Spain. The uprising took it by surprise.
All we knew was that the train from Seville did not arrive. There were rumors that there was trouble in Seville, but nobody knew for sure. I remember that on the morning of the 19th, everybody, well, not everybody, but the workers asked, "What's happening?" And there was a lot going on in the streets. People were wearing their party badges, some with shotguns on their shoulders.
I was working in the harvest when one of my brothers came and said, "Listen, Manolita, the revolution has broken out." "But what revolution is this?" "It was on the 18th of July, he said. So everybody left the harvest and came to town.
This is the man, Manuel Vázquez Guillén, who a generation later organized the village war memorial. He was a socialist. So were most of the laborers and peasants of Lora del Rio. This wasn't especially meaningful. The villages all around were political one way or another. But to the army rebellion, they all responded the same way. They set up revolutionary committees in the town hall to defend their villages against the soldiers setting out from Seville. They also seized the goods of the well-to-do and shared them out.
Entonces salió un camión, iban recogiendo toda la existencia en todas las tiendas, todos los comercios. A truck went out to all the shops, requisitioning all the merchandise. Everything was put together in a store, and all the people had to go there. Everybody was treated alike by the committee. Everybody got the same quantities per person, so many grams of rice, chickpeas, or meat. For meat, instead of killing animals, which we might later need for our work in the fields, we took the fighting bulls. We went and took the bulls because we didn't need entertainment. We only wanted food for the villagers, and we didn't want to use the cattle which were needed for working the land.
Some people had never seen the color of cooked meat. They had seen it at the butcher's, but never cooked. Very soon, people became tired of eating meat.
You know, some people might immediately think, how could that be right? You have Russia, you have others. What is the revolution, and why isn't there enough attention on it through this grand camouflage?
Because of probably the most effective victory of political propaganda in the 20th century, carried on by the Comintern and leftist partisans of the Popular Front Republican government during the Civil War, which have managed to disguise the facts very well. And also, we have to take in fact that it's always difficult prior to the late 20th century for foreign commentators and viewers to understand Spain. Probably Spanish history is the most misunderstood, the most manipulated, the most distorted of any West European country in general. But this was a very particularly egregious case of that during the 1930s. There were in Spain more different kinds of revolutionary movements, probably, than any other country in the world in the 1930s. And once they had given up the communist-type tactic, the Leninist tactic of the armed insurrection, and decided to follow the fascist tactic of forming alliances and taking over from the inside out rather than the outside in, through corrupt elections in 1936, they gained control of the Republican political system and then were able progressively to carry out the revolution, even though it was not a single revolution, because there were various different revolutionary movements, and they all had different ideas about it. The most extreme, in one sense, were the anarchists. The main revolutionary movement were the revolutionary socialists, the main part of the Socialist Party, the most organized, the largest, most organized leftist party, and the communists, who curiously were the moderates, because by that time, the communists had adopted the tactic of the Popular Front. The Soviet Union had a government under the dictator Stalin that finally realized that the Leninist tactic of revolutionary insurrection no longer worked. And you had to follow the fascist tactic of participating in elections and pretending to be part of the regular game so as to get control semi-peacefully from the inside rather than with violence from the outside. And that was the great difference in strategy in 1936 with the Popular Front in Spain compared with the revolutionary insurrections which had taken place between 1930 and 1934. All the revolutionary insurrections had failed except for the one that was electoral, the participating in municipal governments, which gave the left, in its more moderate pre-revolutionary form, a majority for the first time, and brought the collapse of the monarchy and the coming of the republic. Every time the left had turned to revolutionary tactics, this had happened on 4 occasions between 1932 and 1934, this had failed. Popular Front was a new style approach, which was much more effective, just as it had been for Mussolini and Hitler in Italy and Germany in years before that time. And that really placed the revolutionaries in a position partially of power, and others of them at least being semi-protected by those in power, so the revolution could take place bit by bit, gradually from the inside. Once electoral manipulation and corruption had made it possible thoroughly to dominate and control the political system, and a government was installed under the Popular Front that refused to enforce the law and the Constitution, then ultimately there seemed to be no recourse but to adopt the leftist tactic. So you have the left following fascist tactics and the right following leftist insurrectionary tactics, because the success of the fascist tactics followed by the left had left the right really with no recourse except armed revolt. This was a paradox and very difficult to understand. And in fact, it's not really understood by the great majority of historians today.
Alan, where would you say it started to bust up?
I think I agree with Paul that violence is always endemic within the struggle between an old Spain which has not yet relinquished its social and economic power and the attempt by political authorities to impose a new order. But I mean, I think there is this long thread of apocalyptic rightism, which is, in a sense, goes from the beginning of the Republic, which never is reconciled with it. But I mean, I actually think that always there's this fallacy that the Republic degenerates into disorder, and this is why there's a military coup. If you actually look at what happens coolly between 31 and 36, it's always the left that gets its head broken by Republican public order, if you like, legislation, police force and so forth. There is no kind of equatable situation between the Republic is going down between violence on the left and the right. It is the right and the army that the Republic in the end cannot control. But there is a concerted campaign amongst various groups on the right to present the situation as if the Republic simply cannot control public order.
Right. You spend a lot of time in the book, and of course it'll be in the show notes. I highly recommend people read it. And you have a very useful glossary to help people like me keep up with all the different groups. I mean, there's got to be at least a dozen of them. And as you pointed out, I hope the listener caught it. The communists were the moderates in this conflict, mostly for PR, it seems like. But so you focus on the assassination of the politician named Calvo Sotelo, and how this made those like General Emilio Mola and Francisco Franco realize that to not rebel was more dangerous to them than to rebel. We flesh that out for the listener. That might not make much sense, how the assassination of this politician would lead the nationalist insurrectionists to do what they did.
Well, the personal politics, for example, of Francisco Franco, who was the most prominent figure in the high command of the Spanish army during those years, were right-wing, but generally moderately responsible right-wing. He had been a monarchist down to 1931, was appalled by the overthrow of the monarchy, which he thought was going to open the way to chaos. He was, of course, 100% correct in that regard. That was exactly the way things worked out. But on the other hand, once Spanish opinion accepted the new republic, Franco also accepted the republic, said, well, this is the established law of the land, and as long as it obeys law and constitution, we'll have to follow it and obey it, because this is the way things are in the 20th century, and make the best out of this for the well-being of Spain. And Franco, under the Republic, was associated with the center and the moderate conservatives, the moderate right, who promoted him rapidly in the high command of the Spanish army until he became the chief of the general staff by 1935, and was recognized as the principal figure in the army, but a man always of moderate political persuasion. As conditions began to deteriorate and various military leaders discussed the possibility of an armed revolt, he said, no, let's not do that unless everything collapses completely, because military revolts mainly fail. They tend to be irresponsible, they get out of control, and they do not succeed. They make matters worse rather than better, and therefore we have to proceed very slowly, very carefully, and very responsibly. And that was his position in the spring of 1936 as conditions deteriorated more and more in Spain until finally the point had broken down where the leader of the opposition in parliament was kidnapped and murdered by left-wing police forces. Once you had the security system of the state itself involved in having the police carry out revolutionary kidnappings and murders, Franco concluded the situation had become so bad there really was no longer any reliable Republican state at all, and this was going to be the last opportunity to do something about it. The time had come to carry out an armed revolt and fight just as hard as one could to bring in a new political system in Spain. That was the situation by the time he landed in Morocco on the 19th of July, as you pointed out, in 1936.
It's fascinating. And then, of course, once it starts, you mention if the attempt by the Republican government to moderate had happened a week earlier, likely the war wouldn't have happened. But as soon as Franco, which you mentioned, did the first military airlift of an army, which is just fascinating. There's a lot of cool little facts along the way in your analysis, but the first military airlift from Morocco to southern Spain occurred. It was all in. And once the Republican government decides to arm the workers, that's when this revolution that gets hidden often in standard histories takes off. This was fascinating part of your book. I wanted to read this, give the listener a sample. You list 7 different kinds of revolutionary or state controls that emerged on the Republican side. No single system ever emerged. And 40% of all farmland in the Republican zone was taken over, or proportionately about twice the amount seized in Russia during 1917 and 1918, their revolution. Of all land expropriated, 54%, amounting to 21% of all arable land, was organized into collectives. And so you point out, in Spain, there's a much greater percentage of the agrarian population that's consciously revolutionary than even in Russia. That's just absolutely fascinating fact that I had no idea till your work.
This is correct. The Civil War opened the way for the complete revolutionary takeover in the so-called Republican zone. The Republic really ceased to exist, and the revolutionary regime was then formed. That was because the existing left-wing Republican government, which was led by the moderate left and was trying to support the revolution while controlling it, decided that it could not fight the Civil War with half an army. Only half the Spanish army joined the revolt. Half the army nominally remained loyal to the left Republican government. But the conclusion was that half of the army could not be trusted, and there wasn't enough left except the forming of a new worker militia and eventually a revolutionary people's army, a new so-called Republican army, the Revolutionary People's Army, to fight against the military rebels. And while this was being developed, the Republican government was taken over by the leaders of the revolutionaries themselves, so that there was in power a revolutionary government after the first 6 weeks of the Civil War. This was a process that proceeded stage by stage. The final stage had not quite been reached, but was almost there by the time the Civil War began. The final stage was reached 6 months after the Civil War started, when the mass violent revolution had broken out, and a revolutionary government under Largo Caballero, the main revolutionary leader, was formed. In Spain, there were many more workers, that is, urban workers, proletarians in the Marxist sense, than in Russia, proportionately, in 1917. And therefore, you had more of the population involved in the revolution, whereas in Russia, the great majority, the peasants, were not at first involved and only wanted to get more farmland and had no revolutionary consciousness in a land where conditions and institutions had collapsed as a result of World War I. In Spain, there were organized movements which were consciously and directly organizing workers and also farm workers, and even a certain portion of the small farmers as well, in direct revolutionary organizations. So as far as a participatory worker revolution went, this was much more of a broad-based worker revolution in the Republican zone than what we ever found in 1917 in Russia. In Russia, a small minority simply took over because of the breakdown of all institutions. It was a totally different kind of situation in Russia. Institutions were ceasing to exist altogether. In Spain, they had been taken over by the revolutionaries, so that Lenin stepped in to recreate new conditions with the most effectively organized party, which was his dictatorially formed Bolsheviks. In Spain, the Lenin turned out to be someone on the other side who was General Franco, who managed to create a unified force on the part of the counter-revolutionaries, which became the Franco nationalist movement of the Civil War, and managed to fight and win the Civil War.
Yeah, I looked up a historian of the Bolshevik Revolution. He writes that many more people were employed as extras in the movie, the 1928 film October, Sergei Eisenstein, than actually took part in the real event. So the Soviet mythology was actually a Spanish Republican reality. And that's what I want people to realize. I had no idea that one of the most extreme revolutions, because of this grand camouflage of hiding the entire Spanish left under Republican democracy, has hidden one of the most radical events of the 20th century. And your book just brought it right out in context. It's incredible. But it seems like there's also propaganda on both sides. You have all the nationalists characterized as fascists. We'll come back to that later. And all the Republicans characterized as Reds or communist. But in fact, most nationalists were not fascist and most Republicans were not communist. In the more mainstream coverage of this war, it often centers, of course, in covering the atrocities, maybe selectively. There's a old documentary on the Spanish Civil War that I watched that showed horrific footage of the bombing of Madrid, and yet in your book there's this other side of even perhaps as many as 10,000 shot Soviet style in Madrid by the left, and the Spanish Karen and the attempted cover-up, 2,500 summarily executed and dumped into pits, and then the attempt to cover up an investigation on this. Will you take us through how we should understand atrocities in this war on both sides and avoid a story that denies one half of the whole?
Atrocities were characteristic of all the revolutionary civil wars in Europe in the first half of the 20th century, some more than others, but revolutionary atrocities are very common. In revolutionary situations, there is carried out a process of political dehumanization in which the enemy is seen as a mortal threat and as a living cancer that has to be exterminated, because the only way you can deal with the cancer is to exterminate it, otherwise it's going to take over and destroy you. And therefore, the dehumanized enemy seen as a cancer simply has to be eliminated and sometimes killed in large numbers. This began in Russia, but it took place even in so civilized a country as Finland in the Finnish Civil War, and so on all the way down through Spain. The left began shooting people in the first Republican revolt against the monarchy in 1930 and continued in each of the revolutionary insurrections, reaching a high point finally in the first part of the Civil War. The revolutionaries executed something over 50,000 people, and the counter-revolutionaries in the long run, who finished the job and won the victory, probably executed at least as many, and possibly even a few more if you include the 15,000 who were executed after the end of the Civil War in punishment for the revolutionary crimes. So you have a lot of victims of direct execution in the Civil War, approximately the same number on both sides. And you can't really be sure which one killed the larger number, but it well may have been that the counter-revolutionaries in the long run who won the victory and finished the job actually shot a few more people. That will never be known for sure, but approximately 100,000 people, probably a little over 100,000 people, were executed if you put the victims on both sides together during the Civil War. And given the process of dehumanization, this was characteristic of all the revolutionary civil wars, going on down through the Greek Civil War, even after World War II.
Was it Franco's inability to conquer Madrid early in the war that led to the bombing of the civilian center? I know this was another first in Europe.
No, the only bombing of Madrid of any consequence took place in the attempt first to conquer Madrid. But Franco had a very big air force, and the volume of bombs dropped on Madrid was very slight in comparison with World War II. And after just a few months of bombing, carried out mainly with the participating planes that were then sent after the war began from Germany, Franco saw that this was doing more harm than good and stopped bombing Madrid. There were actually more bombings of civilian areas, if you count the individual cases during the Civil War, by the Republican or Revolutionary Air Force than by Franco. But Franco had the participation of planes from Germany and Italy, who generally were more effective than the Soviet flyers participating on the Republican side from the Soviet Union once the war began. And therefore, Franco's bombers were more effective in individual cases. And in a couple of instances during the northern campaign in the Basque Country, bombed Basque towns, which were centers of military activity. These became notorious propaganda cases, particularly the bombing of Guernica, which was picked up by Pablo Picasso, who was a very left-wing artist after World War II, engaged in a lot of communist propaganda to paint his great mural, Guernica, of the bombing of this Basque town at the end of April of 1937. And this became a strong point of Republican propaganda during the Civil War, that the Franco was bombing towns and cities. As a matter of fact, there was such an outcry after the Basque campaign that Franco extended the relative ban on bombing in Madrid to the entire war, that bombing civilian areas did more harm than good, had rarely happened anyway. And from that time on, gave strict orders that bombing concentrated on military targets or only on parts of cities that were connected directly, primarily with the war effort. That made the bombing took place on the port areas in eastern Spain, the Republican zone, that were receiving military goods from the Soviet Union. The outcome of all of this, of course, was there was so much protest and so much propaganda on the Republican side about Franco's bombing of towns that the League of Nations conducted an investigation in 1938. And no one cites the results of the League of Nations investigation, which was that there didn't seem to be any deliberate bombing of towns for terrorist effects, and that private bombs fell on towns with only a few exceptions. That is, Mussolini's intervention in 1938 in Barcelona were carried out on specific kinds of military or military-connected facilities, like port facilities in the Eastern Republican port cities. So the League of Nations report did not support the contention of Republican propaganda.
Interesting. One of the just deep insights that you cover in your book is what actually leads to a revolution like this. You write, in Spain, there had first occurred the most basic of all revolutions, the socio-revolution of rising expectations. And you bring out some fascinating insights from Tocqueville and others. Will you take us through this? I think most people listening may not have a sense of a proper perspective, I should say, on what is the ultimate root of revolution?
Well, the most common idea is the revolutionary idea of revolution. The revolution occurs when the population is sorely oppressed and then rises up to cast off its chains. In fact, we find that in the case of the major European revolutions of modern times, that is the attempt to overturn the not merely political order, but socioeconomic order as well, the revolution comes about as a result of a revolution of rising expectations. You can't have a revolution without revolutionary movements. Revolutionary movements are formed. They normally fail. What happens in several key instances, however, is that the revolutionary movements begin to develop in conflicting situations, and that the circumstances reach a boiling point that finally boil over only after there has been a period of considerable improvement, which is followed by a downturn. That is, the period of considerable improvement has gotten everybody expecting more and more progress and improvement. And then there's a temporary depression or crisis or downturn in which people are gravely disappointed. They have known better circumstances or the prospect of better circumstances very recently and have gotten their hopes up. Then negative circumstances follow. And after this disappointment, then there's a sudden uprising to try to restore the good old days and carry them much farther into outright revolution. And that's when the revolution takes place. The revolution of raising expectations, and not merely the revolution of the terribly oppressed. Because when people are terribly oppressed, they're usually so weak and downtrodden, they just have no power to carry out revolutions. And there aren't any revolutions. It's really in circumstances of rapidly improving societies where people's hopes have been stimulated to a high point and are suddenly temporarily frustrated by some circumstances. There's finally a lashing out. These are not the heavily oppressed, but people for whom circumstances have been getting quite a bit better in recent times, but have suddenly encountered some new frustrations.
Right. You let me give another sample of the book to the listener. You point out this is a rich insight from Alexis de Tocqueville. Quote, potential revolutionary situations do not develop among the poorest and most downtrodden societies in which people lack all empowerment. Revolutionary movements, like most other modern political phenomena, require a certain level of education and development. Revolutionary situations do not develop from conditions of massive oppression, but rather in societies that have experienced growth, improvement, or development that stimulates a psychological disposition to seek even more rapid change. Revolutionary aspirations then come to the fore after improvement has been temporarily frustrated, creating new problems and disappointments for which a more radical solution is sought. In Spain, the revolution of rising expectations had been generated by the rapid growth and relative prosperity of the 1920s, followed by democratization. So I love insights like this because they're sometimes counterintuitive, and I wanted to bring that to the listener. Now, you cover also this isn't just a revolution. This is a revolutionary civil war. Will you tell us the difference? What makes this? You already hinted at it earlier on the atrocities, but what makes this particularly violent?
What made it particularly violent was the radical character of the revolutionary movements, which had been encouraging hatred of the political opposition throughout the years of the Republic. And really because of this stimulation of mass propaganda, the revolutionary movements functioning basically as hate movements. The so-called bourgeoisie was not merely oppressive, but was thoroughly evil, inherently evil, that it had to be exterminated like a cancer, else it would continue to poison and ultimately eliminate all possibility of revolutionary activity in the long run. And the only way to have a healthy society was to carry out eliminations en masse That was the psychology of the revolutionary movements, in Spain functioned as hate movements, which is normally what violent revolutionary movements do. They are the most important organized hate movements.
Yeah, it's a conflict of ultimates. I loved the way you put it, where it becomes more apocalyptic, and this attempt at creating a new world must envision the enemy, quote, as not an ordinary political rival, but as a kind of metaphysical incarnation of evil that must be eradicated before it infects or imposes the same terror on one's own side. And you point out the use of the rhetoric of extermination relative to progress. Scary.
Uh-huh.
We should probably learn from this.
Yes, it is. The process of Spain from about 1933 through 1937, and a good object lesson for any society in modern times about the degeneration and manipulation of democratic conditions to create radical situations and ultimately degenerate into kind of mass hatred.
One thing I want to better understand is the Spanish understanding of this period, and maybe even afterward with Franco, of religious liberty. Surely it's not exactly the same heritage as what we've had in the United States. What was the state of, let's say, even Protestantism, the freedom of other Christians besides Roman Catholicism to practice during this period and into the Franco regime?
Well, the Republic, during its moderate phase, had separated church and state fully and officially for the first time in all of Spanish history. Spanish history had been informed spiritually and in some other ways by Catholicism, so that Spain had become not the most exemplary Catholic country, but simply the most extensively, thoroughly Catholic country. And so the change in Spain was considerable. But the revolutionaries were ferocious anti-clericals because they identified the Catholic Church as the main support of the old non-revolutionary, anti-revolutionary order. And in a metaphysical and spiritual sense, they were probably correct in that. And so anti-clericalism, meaning mass revolutionary violence against Catholic clergy, against churches, and against Catholics in general, was very fundamental to the Spanish Revolution, much more than in Russia. In Russia, Lenin realized that ordinary Russian people were still nominally Orthodox Christians, and that to attack the church as a or the major enemy would be totally counterproductive and make it impossible for Lenin and his Bolsheviks to take over and consolidate the takeover through a civil war. They had to lay off the clergy and the church in Russia in order to win the civil war. Then they turned on the church in a major way. In Spain, anti-clericalism was so fundamental to the revolutionary movements because of the place of Catholicism in Spanish life. They made it one of their central activities from the very beginning. The anarchists particularly, although they weren't the only violent anti-clericals, made of this a centerpiece. So they went after the clergy and would rather shoot priests and burn churches than fight the Civil War. It's one of the reasons why they lost the Civil War. They paid more attention to waging the revolution than fighting the Civil War. In the case of Franco, the counter-revolutionary government established by the military at first was simply going to reform the Republic in a more conservative direction and maintain the separation of church and state. But the revolutionaries turned the conflict so completely during the first weeks of the Civil War into a religious war. And the Catholics were so thoroughly lined up on the one side, if they were genuinely believing and participating Catholics, that Franco felt he had no course but to make the new counter-revolutionary state a fully officially Catholic state. That accorded with Franco's own point of view because he was a devout Catholic in the Spanish fashion. And so the new Franco regime would remain an officially Catholic state all the way down to the very end. It provided religious freedom in terms of private and personal worship for other religions, but no other religion could engage in public religious activity. No other religion could even put up a sign saying, "This is our church." They could have their little churches, but they had to be completely anonymous without any publicity on behalf of their religion, even the point of having a name for the church outside the religious building. Therefore, the freedom of religion of other groups, cults as they were called in Spain, was very limited. It existed, it was strictly private and personal.
Did he make any sort of distinction between, say a Protestant religion that's Trinitarian and say, an LDS religion that denies the Trinity? Or was it just Roman Catholicism or everything else is a cult and must be only private, no public worship?
The latter point of view was essentially the attitude that prevailed. Everything else was simply a cult that had to be private. Remember that the Protestant minority in Spain was very tiny, scarcely more than 0.1%. You couldn't even find Protestants most of the time. You had to be lucky to run Protestant. They were not persecuted overtly, but they were strongly restricted and otherwise simply ignored.
Right. And I think it's obviously very messy. I think, we had Dr. Paul Gottfried on to discuss his book on fascism. And one of the things he pointed out was some of the irony of Americans taking the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, of course, not understanding the revolution at all, but simply kind of more based on an anti-clericalism. They just didn't, the Franco side seemed so overtly Roman Catholic. They don't realize they're taking the side of atheists and Trinity deniers and stuff like that on the other side, when they make a statement of supporting the revolution, or I should say the Republic. Do you have any comments in that space of how we should let it be this kind of nuanced case to either way?
Well, it was very easy for Comintern and Republican propaganda during the Civil War to simply revive the old Spanish black legend. The attitude was, revolution, what revolution? You see, the Spanish Catholic Church is in power once more. This is like the days of the Inquisition. So it was really a revival of the black legend. And as far as American opinion was concerned, it looked as though it was a complete return to the old order. And there has always been a certain amount of fundamental anti-Catholicism in the United States. And that was easier. Yes. All the more because the only people in the United States who really strongly took the counter-revolutionary position tended to be Roman Catholic. And so it all fit together. It all seemed to fit together as far as the American point of view was concerned. The predominant opinion was in favor of the Republic. The revolution was completely camouflaged, never existed as far as most American commentary on the Spanish Civil War was concerned. And this was simply Hitler in Spain, not really Franco, because Franco was simply the stooge for Hitler. That was the general idea by 1938. And for those who had strong opinions about the Spanish Civil War, that's the way they looked at it. But foreign opinion, though very strong about the Spanish Civil War, was really dominated by political opinions of people in other countries for their own particular purposes, and was not the result of any understanding or keen analysis of the situation in Spain. The situation in Spain was irrelevant. What was important was the images that were developed of that in terms of political propaganda in other countries.
Right. It really is. Is there anything equivalent you can think of today? I think of how many people are so firmly positioned politically when it comes to the state of Israel and the Palestinians, and yet we don't, yeah, I mean, they probably don't know anything about it. Is that the only equivalent in our world where you have just so many coalitions of different people taking sides in a way that is incoherent the more you get into the details of what's actually going on?
To some extent, yes. I think you could say that. It's a different kind of circumstance because the fight in the Middle East is really political and ethnic as much as it is religious. But there's some analogy, a certain analogy there.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, it's interesting. Well, thanks for helping me. There's as a Protestant, I feel mixed in my analysis of Franco, of course, because I see what he's opposing and I want nothing to do with that. But I'm also, convictionally Protestant. So I just hope the listener can see this is messy. You need nuance and allow for Spain to be Spain on its own terms. And you want all the facts before you jump to some conclusion based on one issue.
I will simply cite for you one example. The leading Protestant intellectual in Spain during the past generation is a very prolific historian and a writer named Vidal, who now lives in Miami and devotes himself really to the proselytization of Spanish language Protestantism. But he's written extensively on the Spanish Civil War. And as Spain's leading Protestant intellectual in the issues of the Civil War, he pretty strongly supports the Franco position in the Civil War because of the horrors of the revolution.
Right.
No illusions about the revolutionaries.
Yeah, you point out, jumping back to just the extent of the anti-clericalism. I mean, it is absolutely stunning, and I think this should be kept in mind when we look at the use of the word crusade on the nationalist side and look at some of the statements of the clergy you point out in your book. But you break down the numbers as far as we know them, that the total amount is 6,788, or nearly 10% of all clergy, and a much higher percentage of bishops, religious, and priests. Well more than 20% of all categories of male clergy were murdered during the war. The percentage was higher still for the main Republican zone. I mean, that is astounding. And you said it stands as proportionately the most extensive and also most concentrated massacre of Catholic clergy we have on record. It exceeds even what we know of the radicals in France in 1792. That is just stunning.
That's because, as I was saying, the Spanish War quickly became a kind of war of religion. Well, this is never the way it's presented. It's always put in strictly, narrowly political terms, democracy versus fascism.
Yeah, and no. This is a religiously motivated hatred. You point out that the clergy are going to step in. You point out a statement by Bishop, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, Marcelino Olaquea, as well as a collective letter by all but 5 of the remaining surviving church hierarchy on June 1st, 1937, firmly taking the side of the nationalists and using the word crusade. Would you say that the religious motivation that is anti-religious, this what you call millennial antinomianism, leading to the murder of clergy, the murder of the rich, et cetera, brought out a Spanish clerical response on the side of Franco? Will you take us through this, how to understand this more as a religious war, that this was really a war of religion?
It was not a crusade, in the classic sense of the term, but it was a war of religion. And the strongest single motivation for the counter-revolutionaries in the war aside from the very basic one of, you might say, almost everyone in wars, of saving their bacon and preserving their own interests, was simply the religious one. And it was the religious spirit that provided the strongest sense of morale and courage and determination among the nationalist forces. So that you find in the military conflicts, whenever a nationalist stronghold was surrounded, besieged, and there were attempts to destroy it, the nationalists held out and fought to the death. When that happened for a Republican group, it was besieged. It tended to collapse much more quickly. And the difference was simply the high morale on the part of the nationalists, supported very strongly by Roman Catholicism, and their kind of Christian conviction. This is not to say that the Republicans, the revolutionaries, did not have morale of their own. They certainly did, part of the time, but not as much and not as long, partly because, of course, they tended to lose more and more as the war went on. But religion was a very fundamental source of support, the most important single specific source of support for the counter-revolutionaries in the Spanish Civil War.
Right. And I love the context of Spain generally you give. And by the way, just so you know, my fiance is listening to your book. It's not yet in English, but your defense of the Spanish Empire in Espanol. My fiance is Latina and just loving the book. She just thinks it's fantastic. But you point out that Spain was basically under Muslim rule for 3 centuries. And the strong anti-clericalism of 3 years isn't going to change them returning. You know, 3 centuries of Muslim domination won't crush their Christianity. Certainly 3 years of civil war won't. And I think that's got to be kept in mind, right, with this use of religious language. In fact, you point out that, fascinating, Catholic Ireland was the only Western democracy to support Franco.
Yes, absolutely the case.
Franco himself, so much of the coverage, I was just curious how he was covered in more mainstream sources, including even the BBC, and that was one of the more substantive sources I could find, apart from, of course, your biography, which will be in the show notes. Typically treat him like religion. His views were just political. It was pragmatic. Was he devout? You take us into kind of his religious life and maybe some of the features of the Catholicism he claimed, help the listener understand him better.
En la entrada de 1939, la España nacional ofrece a todos los pueblos, con sus glorias y heroicos sacrificios, su voluntad de cooperar a la paz del mundo con su victoria. En la España que forjamos no habrá un hogar sin lumbre ni una familia sin pan. En la entrada de 1939, la España nacional ofrece a todos los pueblos, con sus glorias y heroicos sacrificios, su voluntad de cooperar a la paz del mundo con su victoria.
That's a very good question. Was Franco devout? In a formal way, yes. Later on, he always had his own private chapel near his bedroom, always had evening prayers. If evening prayers are a sign of religious devotion, then Franco was devout. He no question that he was a believing and a practicing Catholic. I know I can't give you intimate details of Franco's spiritual life because only his confessor would know that. And I can't even tell you for sure how frequently Franco confessed. But he was a practicing Catholic, and he certainly was a believing Catholic and a man of at least a certain degree of individual devotion. His 2 brothers were not. His father certainly would not. His father was an absolute liberty, but his mother was extremely devout, and Franco was devoted to his mother and alienated from his father. And that's part of the secret of Franco's own individual personality.
He ruled even pre and post Vatican II. Is there any significant shifts in his view during that time, or did he just stay the course here in Spain?
To St. Peter's Basilica, the heart of the Catholic world, come 2,600 prelates, including Los Angeles' Cardinal McIntyre, for the opening of the 21st Ecumenical Council. It is the greatest gathering of church dignitaries in all history, and the conclave itself is one of the significant religious events of our times. Pope John the 23rd in shining white vestments is carried through St. Peter's Square. The council, the first to be called since 1869, is the supreme deliberative body of the Roman Catholic Church. Hundreds of ecclesiastics and laymen have worked for nearly 4 years in preparation for it. From his throne, the Pope will receive the delegates who in the coming months will discuss and vote on 69 schemata, or draft constitutions and decrees designed to bring the Church's procedures and practices up to date in the beginning of the space age. In his opening address, the Pope says to the delegates and invited observers from non-Catholic Christian churches that the Catholic Church considers it her duty to work actively for the unity of the entire Christian family. Such unity has always been one of Pope John's highest aims, as it is of the Council itself.
Of the Wanderer, it said that something like 73% of young Catholics believe that premarital sex is all right. 53% believe that a woman has a right to choose, and many believe that trial marriages are acceptable. Do you see any correlation between these statistics, which betray a certain eroding of the monolicity of the Church, and Vatican II, Father Sanborn?
Absolutely. There is a perfect correlation, because since Vatican II we have seen the complete breakdown of the doctrinal discipline of the Catholic Church.
Would you hold Vatican II responsible for this?
Because Vatican II created a church without dogmas. The soul of Vatican II is ecumenism. And that is the attempt to bring together all religions, to break down their differences and to bring them into one great church. And in order to do that, you must abandon the absolute nature of the teachings of the Catholic Church. You must be able to sit down with people of other religions and say, well, what we believe is negotiable. And this created a church without dogmas. So now you have utter dogmatic and moral chaos in the Catholic Church.
Striking developments of Vatican II was the new Mass. The liturgy was reformed. Why don't you say the new Mass? Why are you adamant and insistent upon saying the traditional Latin Mass, Father Sanborn?
Because it looks like a Protestant service. That's why I don't say it. That's why I originally reacted to it. I reacted when I was 14 years old to the initial changes made in 1964 to the Mass, and I recognized in them the beginnings of the Protestantization of the Mass.
He stayed the course. He was appalled by what happened in Vatican II.
Oh, fascinating.
I had seen a personal memorandum by Franco in which he wrote in the margin of the memorandum, "Que puñalada por la espalda." What a stab in the back in terms of the change in the Church's political position.
Wow.
Vis-a-vis the Franco regime in the late 1960s.
That is absolutely
So
fascinating.
he felt really betrayed. He felt completely betrayed. The Franco regime had supported and paid for the restoration or new construction of 1,000 Catholic churches in Spain. and had supported the church with a state budget all the way through, had given the church every possible kind of support within reason during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, into the 1960s. And then came Vatican II, and more of the clergy began to line up with the political opposition. He felt it was a total betrayal. He could not change, and he did not change his support of the church, but he felt that the clergy, the leadership of the church, had betrayed him and was changing politically. But all he could do was to maintain his convictions and stay the course. So his basic policy vis-a-vis the church never changed.
Wow. And maybe I should have asked this just a little bit ago. Is there anything that comes to mind in terms of Franco's personal thoughts about Protestantism, other than just it's a cult? But did he ever delve into theology, as far as we can tell, or in a more intellectual way?
No, I'm not aware of any particular intellectual study of religion by Franco. No, he knew very little about Protestantism, had a very simple idea of Protestantism, and considered it pernicious. On the other hand, he recognized there were different kinds of Protestants, and some were better than others. Some were not allied with Masons, but were more truly productively liberal, and you could cooperate with them, and they could even be helpful to Spain in the Cold War. So he differentiated between Protestants and Protestants, but he didn't study Protestantism seriously, didn't know anything about Protestantism theologically, and always held it at arm's length. The most open Protestant services you could attend, as I did a few times, Spain in the old days, were on American military bases. Because the Spanish laws did not there apply.
Wow. Well, was he, I think as we head toward a close, of course, we have to address the elephant in the room in the sense of, was Franco a fascist? How do we understand? Is it pronounced Falange or the Falange?
Falange.
Okay, yeah.
Relax.
Right. Understanding Spanish fascism. And, it seems, frankly, it seems like half the coverage of Franco is simply the support Hitler and Mussolini gave during the Civil War. It seems like half of the coverage of him is that. It's not even him. So was he a fascist? Does he qualify as a fascist in any way during the war or in his rule thereafter?
Not really, no. Franco was always preferably a political Catholic, though he was willing to cooperate with a reasonable, lawful separation of church and state if he had to, which he certainly did under the Republic for several years. But he didn't really understand fascism because he was fundamentally very conservative and not a revolutionary. Fascism is a special kind of revolutionary movement, which he didn't really have much deep perception of. When he saw that he was going to be probably called upon to play a political role in the last years before the Civil War, he tried to read more about fascism and various political alternatives. And he found during the Civil War that the new political movement coming to the fore in the nationalist zone was the Falange, which was the native Spanish fascist movement. That in itself was a paradox, because Spain was the European country, the large European country at least, in which fascism was the weakest before the Civil War. Why was that? Because organized nationalism was weak in Spain. Fascism depends on organized nationalism, and there had been very little organized nationalism because Spain was a neutral power and not involved in international conflicts. There had been no forces in the late 19th and early 20th century stimulating nationalism in Spain the way you wouldn't find them in many other European countries. So nationalism was weak. And in fact, several years before the Civil War, one of the leading Spanish socialist intellectuals said, well, one thing we won't have to worry about in Spain is fascism. You can't have fascism in Spain because there's no significant nationalism here, and there's just no base on which fascism could draw. So fascism will not be part of our problem. The revolution can go ahead, but it won't have to deal with fascism. Well, that all changed with the Civil War, because then the Falange, as the Spanish form of a fascist movement, was militantly and militarily organized, and it came to the fore as the main expression of politics in the nationalist zone, supporting and fighting the military effort to win the conflict. And Franco, very early in the Civil War, this is, I would say, of all the aspects of Franco's political career, the most difficult precisely to document because we have no surviving materials. In the first 6 weeks, approximately, 6 to 8 weeks of the Civil War, changed his political attitude. He believed that the military revolt should maintain a conservative right-wing republic, might even maintain separation of church and state, should not change Spain any more than it had to, but simply throttle the revolution. Realized with the outbreak of full-scale revolution in the Republican zone, this was a completely revolutionary, counter-revolutionary project. And you don't defeat the revolution merely with moderation. You have to have a counter-revolutionary project. The counter-revolutionary project was a new kind of state, a Spanish nationalist state, which would be authoritarian, like the new wave of politics in Europe, and would have to have organized political form. Spain had had a very moderate revolution, very moderate dictatorship during the 1920s for 6.5 years, from 1923 to 1930, which really had no particular ideology or doctrine except Spanish patriotism. So Franco was concerned above all to avoid the mistake and failure of the first moderate dictatorship, what he called the primo de rivera mistake after the first Republican dictator, of not having a political system and not having a doctrine and ideology. And he decided to take over the Falangist movement as the state movement, but merge it with the most right-wing Catholics, the Carlists, at the same time, to moderate the radical fascism of the Falange as a new kind of state party, which was going to be molded further under the new Franco regime. So there was undoubtedly a real dose of fascism in the Falange, and in the FET, the Falange Española Tradicionalista, as it was called, the traditionalist Spanish phalanx. Of course, fascism as a revolution cannot be traditionalist. There was a contradiction in terms right there. The leader of the new party was none other than Franco, who was not a fascist and was determined to control the fascists. This then led to various conspiracies by radical revolutionary phalangists to overthrow Franco. They realized that was hopeless once the Civil War was over. Franco had complete control of the army, and he had such prestige among all the anti-revolutionary forces in Spain that there was no hope of governing without him. And so the Phalangists simply had to put up with Franco, and he dominated the fascist movement. He was not dominated by a fascist movement. Although he was on the national, German side during the half of the World War, he received support from Germany and particularly from fascist Italy in waging the Civil War, as the Republic had received support from the Soviet Union throughout. He began to realize that he could not go very far. Spain always remained neutral during World War II. At one point, it was tempted to move closer to belligerence by a declaration of non-belligerence for 2 years, from 1940 to 42. And then Franco realized he was making a mistake. By 1942-43, he moved back to neutrality and managed to survive the war. And after 1945, began to de-fascistize what had been a partially fascist regime, a regime with a fascistic component in the Falange though never a fascist regime, and insists that the Spanish regime was a monarchist and a Catholic regime, a different kind of political construct altogether. Franco was not a fascist and thought that, in fact, revolutionary fascists were rather crazy because they were so extreme, and was determined to control them rather than to allow them to control his regime. But he did collaborate with fascists and with fascism during the Civil War, and to some extent during the first 3 years of World War II as well. So there was that factor in the political background of Francoism. Not fascist, but with a certain fascist component and with a certain degree of collaboration with fascism. So it was a very complicated situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know you have an entire book on Franco and Hitler. We'll put in the show notes, but the coverage often makes it seem like him, Mussolini, Hitler are buddy-buddy and aren't taking into account these nuances. I know Mussolini sent actually troops, right? 70,000+, something like that. But one thing, once again, referring to our interview with Paul Gottfried, people don't realize Mussolini and Hitler were not buddy-buddy at that time. Mussolini sent troops up north to protect Austria, was very worried about Hitler's extension of power into Austria. It seems like Franco was worried. I'm trying to remember, you pointed out in the book about Hitler's extension into Poland. Was it Poland that made Franco say, no, that's not okay?
Right, yeah. Right, to mediate in the war right after the invasion of Poland, because the Polish regime was somewhat like the Franco regime.
Right.
And this rather close to home. On the other hand, he realized that he could not make a test case of Poland and would have to swallow the German conquest of Poland and overthrow the Polish regime. But he would like to put an end to the German-Polish War as soon as possible.
Right. So there's just so much more nuance here, right? Was his view of Hitler positive? Like, are there any quotes that are like Hitler's the greatest or whatever that can be latched onto? I was listening specifically for facts in this regard, and I didn't hear any. They were allied, so everything that Hitler did or believed is often impugned to Franco.
No, Franco never became a military ally of Germany, although he came very close when Hitler was riding high, falling after the fall of France, late in 1940. But that was never consummated. He came very close. He was tempted, and he pulled away because Spain was simply too weak, and Germany could not support Spain adequately. The Spanish economy was in terrible shape with the start of World War II, and the destruction wrought by the revolution inside Spain. It never recovered until some years after the World War was over, and required continuous food imports during the World War years. Those could really come from the outside, from the territories controlled by the British Navy. And Franco had to watch his step and not veer too closely toward Germany during the war, because Hitler didn't have the military strength to protect Spanish interests from the Royal Navy or to provide the economic assistance that was received from the United States and other countries as well. Spain was simply in a very weak position, and Franco had to therefore maintain first a genuine neutrality, then a qualified neutrality, and then a genuine neutrality again. He was indeed tempted. All of the neutral countries in Europe were tempted to line up on the German side after the fall of France. And every single one of them collaborated with Germany in one way or the other. Franco wasn't the only one. Democratic Sweden collaborated with Germany. Democratic Switzerland collaborated with Germany, and so on, as well as the right-wing regimes in Eastern Europe. There was economic collaboration, but in the case of Eastern Europe, in the countries caught more between Germany and Russia. There was also direct military collaboration, which resulted, of course, in the complete downfall of those regimes at the end of the war. Though with Eastern Europe occupied by the Soviet Union, any kind of regimes, democratic or otherwise, in Eastern Europe would have been eliminated by Soviet totalitarianism and a military occupation, no matter what, once the war was over.
Right. And just to bring some broader perspective as well, I'm thinking of the work of David Kurtzer. The Vatican couldn't tell either. I mean, the Vatican thought Hitler was going to win the war as well, right? Pope Pius XII. One of the ironies, there are two I want to point out from your book that are just interesting, is even after the hard shift for the overwhelming majority of the clergy to the nationalist side, and the explicit use of religious language on the nationalist side to win, the Vatican wasn't convinced, right? The Vatican wasn't sure what to think of them either.
Well, everything occurs within a certain historical sequence, within a certain kind of time frame. And the Spanish Civil War began in 1936, after the Vatican had negotiated a concordat with Mussolini in 1929 and with Hitler in 1934. And by that time, the Vatican was rather disillusioned with the concordat with Mussolini and very much concerned by the fact that Hitler was not really observing altogether the concordat in Germany. So the Vatican was feeling very burned about its relations with the dictators, and it simply saw Franco as another dictator with whom the church might very badly burn its hands in political relations. So he tended to hold Franco at arm's length, even though Franco was only one of these dictators who declared his regime fully Catholic anyway. Franco came too late after the experiences of Mussolini and Hitler. And Pius XI was basically anti-fascist. He saw the need to collaborate, he thought, with moderate fascism, but he was anti-fascist. He distrusted fascism, and particularly after his experiences with the new concordat with Hitler, he held Franco at arm's length. And Franco said in reply, "This is very unfair. I'm the only really Catholic ruler, even in Catholic Portugal. Salazar, the quasi-dictator of Portugal, has not restored the unity of church and state. I am the only Catholic ruler who is fully identified with the church, who is Catholic, who is a practicing Catholic, who has restored the unity of church and state. But yet my regime alone is being held at arm's length while there are these existing concordats with Italy and Germany. This is not fair." But that's the way it was, of course, for more than 15 years, until the Franco regime was, to a degree, officially internationally rehabilitated by becoming a formal associate of the United States with the signing of the Pax of Madrid by Washington and Madrid in 1953. That rehabilitated Franco to some extent, and finally the Vatican thought the time had come that it was safe to sign a concordat with Spain. But it had taken more than 15 years. Franco thought it was very unfair, although, of course, he understood the strictly political reasoning of the Vatican in connection with that.
Right, right. And you point out, though, it may be belated, at least given a certain perspective. In 1987, the Vatican officially beatified 489 martyrs of the Spanish Civil War, the largest single beatification in Catholic history. So it took a while for the recognition. Franco didn't live to see that. But I thought the politics of the Vatican relative to Franco was one of the more fascinating dynamics in your work.
And it helped to have a Polish pope, because what is forgotten in the very thin literature abroad on the Spanish Civil War is that the Polish government very strongly tended to take the Franco side during the Civil War. The Polish government was the major government, the large government of a relatively large country that lived on the border of the Soviet Union, very much under the Soviet gun, and anti-Sovietism was its stock-in trade. It supported Franco and pointed out that the Spanish Republican government during the Civil War was simply maintaining a grand camouflage and fooling everybody, but that it was being used, in fact, the Revolutionary Popular Front government of Spain was being employed by Stalin as a kind of stalking horse for Soviet international and diplomatic initiatives. The Polish government played a very strong role in that and had some effect in other European governments. Probably the worst enemy diplomatically that the Soviet Union had during the Spanish Civil War. And so when a Polish pope takes over the Vatican, he sees to it that the memory of the Spanish martyrs not forgotten in Rome.
That's fascinating.
John Paul had something to do with that as a Polish pope, given the historical background.
I hadn't even made that connection in my head. Thank you for pointing that out. Another angle, just another kind of irony that was interesting is even the I know it wasn't a crusade, but the talk of it being like one, and yet it should be pointed out that you had the Islamic territory of Morocco, 80,000 Muslims served in Franco's forces, 7% of the total manpower, and 11,000 of them died for the nationalist cause. That part of the irony of the use of the word crusade, right? you have Roman Catholic and Muslim alike fighting for part of this war against the Republican forces.
And the support of Moroccan and even Algerian volunteers from French territory for the Spanish army during the Civil War was sold as a defense of monotheistic religion versus atheism, which made sense to many young Moroccans. And have to remember that the Spanish role in Spanish relations with Morocco, what was left of a new Spanish empire, which lasted only a few years in the 20th century, was based on a different kind of colonialist, if you want to call it that. Really, there was no attempt to colonize Morocco per se, part of the Spanish government, but to insist to Moroccans that they were being assisted by the Spanish in forming a more progressive, benevolent government in Morocco by people in Spain who were the Europeans who had the most historical contact with the Muslims of Northwest Africa, and the Spanish were understanding of Islam in a way that other Europeans were not, and that therefore there was, even under Spanish so-called colonialism, a kind of special relationship between Spaniards and Moroccans. This is quite different from what you get in some other powers in the Islamic world during the early 20th century. Though the Spanish Rif War between 1915 and 1925 was a very nasty colonial conflict, the major colonial conflict going on in the world at that time. The Spanish gave the Moroccans fairly good government after 1925, and to some extent won them over. And they got the Moroccan leaders to support the volunteering of young Moroccans for the Spanish army in the Civil War. And later on, toward the end of the 20th century, when Spanish leftists in democratic Spain would go on vacation to Morocco, if they ever happened to become acquainted with Moroccans individually, sometimes they would be taken to Moroccans home and shown a precious medal that the grandfather had won in the Spanish Civil War, of which the Moroccans were very proud in participating in the crusade against atheism.
Wow.
So you have that paradox as well.
That is just fascinating. We have common ground. We believe in one God. That can't be said of Stalin, right? That's just fascinating. Okay, I got two questions in closing. Why should people care? And there's so much to this war. I mean, we are scratching the surface. I'm just picking a few things to ask you about. But the more I read your work, the more important I see it as being. Why should people care about the Spanish Civil War today?
Well, in one sense, The only reason people should hear about this Spanish Civil War is if they're interested in history and want to get history straight. However, the lessons about the decay of a democracy into a revolutionary process and the complete breakdown of political society that can be learned from the Spanish Republic and its own revolutionary process are very important in the survival and flourishing of democracies in the 21st century. The main lesson here is that democracies ultimately decline from the inside out in well-established democracies more than from the outside in. They're not overthrown by coups d'etats and sudden dictators taking over. They are eroded from within by the distortion and perversion of democratic institutions themselves, so that the Spanish Republic and the process that led to the Spanish Civil War is an object lesson in the maintaining or erosion of democracy in the way this has come about. It is very applicable to democracies in the 21st century.
And I think it would be easy, for me, the listener, to kind of caricature Franco's position that the state needs an official ideology to care about the spiritual. But I think at the very least the last 10, 20 years has shown that something will fill that ideological void when it comes to state policy, no matter what. The secularism is often an illusion that can hide even the encroachment and lobbying of harmful ideologies, to the point where all of a sudden people wake up and realize, wait, I can't just say there are boys and girls anymore. So I think people should consider the question, can a neutral state even exist at all? And then, of course, a corollary to that, should it? And I thought, thank you so much for writing this book. I felt like every chapter had 2 to 3 insights that Americans today and people all around the world should consider for their respective political situations. Of course, I, as a Protestant, do not endorse Franco's position. I don't think I'm part of a cult. But I do think we should consider why he's doing it. And of course, for Franco himself, right, he's thinking, no, the state needs an official ideology, and it's going to be our Roman Catholic heritage, which in Spain was the traditional heritage.
Indeed. About 3 years ago, I wrote an article for the Catholic journal First Things on the object lessons in the erosion of democracy gained from the Spanish Republic. So the most interesting thing about the Civil War, most important thing to know about the Civil War, as Ortega y Gasset, Spain's leading 20th century intellectual, said, is not so much this or that aspect of the Civil War, but simply the issue of how it ever came about in the first place. How did the Civil War begin? How did Spanish society break down? That is the sort of thing to understand, which is most important, anterior to the actual beginning of the Civil War itself.
And yet another lesson, and I know this is so much broader than Spain, really the entire West has cultural amnesia right now. It's easy for me at a distance to say, why don't modern Spaniards appreciate their own heritage like they should? If all you had was the School of Salamanca, Francisco de Vitoria, Bartolome de las Casas, that's just an amazing heritage for a country, and yet we are just amusing ourselves to death. And I think you can see that shallowness reflected. It's hard for me not to roll my eyes if I hear another Republican candidate just running on free markets, taxes, and budgets, as if higher standards of living are in themselves fulfilling a human identity and purpose. I think, as our previous interview with Dr. Joshua Mitchell kind of engages with, there's more to humanity. There's more to a culture. And we should remember, what do we remember of the Greeks? Do we remember, their art or in poetry? or just their attempt to fulfill their material wants. I think we should all be considering this today on the corpse of what was Western civilization. All right, last question. You talk about how in the 1940s and early 1950s, Spanish Catholicism experienced the most extensive revival of traditional Christianity in any Western country during the 20th century. And I was going through your fascinating chapter in A History of Spain, where you also documented your own academic journey in seeing the changes in Spain from the tail end of that to now. What happened? Are there lessons to be learned when it comes to religion and society that, not even the most radical revolution maybe of the 20th century couldn't de-Catholicize Spain thoroughly, and yet modernization in some ways has. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Modernization has, and proved much more deadly. The peaceful revolution, the transformation, much more deadly, much more thorough, much more psychologically effective than the violent revolution of 1936. There was a genuine Catholic revival in the 40s and 50s. No question about that. You can see that in the dramatic rise in the number of young men entering seminaries and joining the clergy at that time. There was a genuine Catholic revival. But after the rehabilitation of the Franco regime, as Spain was more and more involved with the prosperity and life of Western Europe, following particularly 1953, then it became much more international in ethos than before, much more subject to the consumer culture, the psychology of Western Europe. The most important sector of the Spanish economy in many ways became the tourist trade. The tourists were mainly not Americans, but West Europeans. And there was a progressive secularization of culture. That modernization, the kind of process of, if you like, historical materialism, was something that was not withstood, apparently could not be withstood by Spanish society and culture in the 1960s. And Franco never understood that. He was delighted that the country was making such rapid economic progress, the most rapid economic progress in Spanish history in the 1960s. So that, in fact, this made Franco, in terms of material conditions, the way in which the living standards of Spanish people were elevated, and Spain became a prosperous country in a general way, almost for the first time in history. Therefore, in those eyes, the most successful dictator of the 20th century, in terms of the things that were done materially for a country under a dictatorship. Franco was pleased with this, and he strove to make this come about, and was successful in that regard. It wasn't as though it just happened. Spanish economic policy encouraged the process as much as it could, but he didn't understand the inevitable kinds of spiritual and cultural consequences of this kind of increasingly materialist society, subject to the forces of historical materialism, which did not maintain its spiritual ethos. So that by the last years of Franco's life, in the early 1950s, it was a different society. And Franco was bewildered. He just didn't understand how all of this had come about. His heir, Juan Carlos, being much younger, had some sense of that and was determined to move toward a different kind of political system. But Spain was transformed under Franco, but not entirely the way Franco himself intended. And he was bewildered by the paradox.
And yet another paradox in lessons to be learned. It strikes me, and you know better than anyone else alive, the incredible heritage Spain has. The School of Salamanca, Francisco de Vitoria. I mean, of course, every year here in America, without any actual understanding of native religions here in America. We bash Columbus every October, whatever, but no idea of all the improvements as well that were introduced through these things. This is an incredible heritage Spain has. You have cultural amnesia, and people don't care. And you could see it there, and then I look, wait, I mean, it's not much different here in America. It really isn't. We have a cultural amnesia here in the West. And Republican candidate running on balanced budgets and higher standards of living. I just don't think it's cutting it anymore.
That's right. People are living on a shadow, and the shadows are very insubstantial. They no longer support you.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Payne, this has been an absolute honor. I can't thank you enough.
My pleasure. Happy to. Bye.